Welcome to the channel, Slavery of Shadows. Today's story unfolds in 1849 and follows Ruth, a black girl with blue eyes, who used her intelligence to rescue herself from death when every sign around her said there was no way out. What happened afterward was buried for a reason, and one single truth could have cost her her life. This is a difficult and intense story, so take a deep breath and listen carefully. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment which city and country you're listening from. Your participation helps keep these stories remembered instead of buried. Let's begin. On the night of August 12, 1832, in a wooden shack behind the cotton fields of the Grove plantation in Warren County, Mississippi, a baby was born who was supposed to have been killed within her first hour of life. The midwife who delivered her, an enslaved woman named Hattie, who had brought more than 200 children into the world on that plantation, took one look at the newborn and felt her blood run cold. The baby was healthy. The baby was strong. The baby had 10 fingers and 10 toes, and a cry that filled the humid Mississippi night. But the baby also had something that made Hattie's hands tremble as she held her. The baby had blue eyes, not the cloudy, indeterminate color that many newborns display before their true eye color emerges. These eyes were already clear, already bright, already unmistakably blue, blue like cornflowers, blue like the summer sky over the cotton fields, blue like the eyes of Master Thomas Hargrove, who owned every human being on this plantation, and who had visited this particular shack on many nights when his wife was sleeping. Hattie had been delivering babies for 31 years. She knew what those blue eyes meant. She knew what would happen when the mistress found out, and she knew that she had roughly 10 minutes to make a decision that would either save this child's life or end her own. The mother's name was Josephine. She was 23 years old and had been purchased by Thomas Hargrove 6 years earlier at a slave auction in Natchez. She was what the traders called a fancy girl, a term that made Hattie's stomach turn every time she heard it. It meant that Josephine was considered beautiful by white standards, that her skin was lighter than most, that she would fetch a higher price because men like Thomas Hargrove would pay extra for women they intended to use for purposes beyond field labor. Josephine had known what awaited her when she was bought. She had endured it because the alternative was death or worse. And now she lay exhausted on a straw mattress, looking at her daughter, understanding immediately what those blue eyes would cost them both. The mistress of the Hargrove plantation was a woman named Elizabeth, and she was not a fool. She knew what her husband did on the nights when he claimed to be checking on the livestock or inspecting the slave quarters. She knew about the children who had been born on this plantation with skin lighter than their mothers and features that echoed her husband's face. She had learned to ignore these children, to pretend they did not exist, to maintain the fiction that her marriage was respectable and her husband was faithful. But there were limits to what she would ignore. Blue eyes crossed that limit. Blue eyes were evidence that could not be explained away. Blue eyes would make the other plantation owners whisper, and the ladies at church gatherings exchange knowing glances. Blue eyes were an insult that Elizabeth Hargrove would not tolerate. When word reached the big house that Josephine had given birth, Elizabeth came to see for herself. She walked across the yard in the darkness, her white nightgown billowing in the warm August breeze, her face set in an expression that Hattie recognized as barely controlled rage. She entered the shack without knocking because enslaved people had no right to privacy. And she looked down at the baby in Hattie's arms. She saw the blue eyes. She saw her husband's eyes staring back at her from the face of a black child. and she gave the order that Hattie had been dreading. Elizabeth Hargrove did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She simply said that the child was an abomination, that it should never have been born, and that Hattie should take care of it. Before morning, everyone in that room understood what take care of it meant. It meant that Hattie was being ordered to kill a newborn baby. It meant that Josephine would watch her daughter die within hours of giving birth. It meant that the evidence of Thomas Hargrove's crimes would be buried in an unmarked grave behind the slave quarters, and life on the plantation would continue as if nothing had happened. But Hattie had delivered too many babies to follow that order. She had held too many newborns, felt too many tiny hearts beating against her chest, watched too many children grow into adults who worked the same fields their parents had worked. She could not kill this child, not even to save herself. So she did something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She lied. She told Elizabeth that she would handle the situation, that the mistress should return to the big house and not trouble herself with such unpleasant matters. And when Elizabeth left, satisfied that her orders would be obeyed, Hattie wrapped the baby in the cleanest rag she could find and carried her out into the night. The slave cemetery sat at the edge of the plantation in a grove of oak trees that provided shade during the brutal Mississippi summers. It was a place where enslaved people buried their dead, marking graves with wooden crosses that rotted within a few years and stones that sank into the soft earth over time. No white person ever visited the slave cemetery. It was considered beneath their notice, a place for property to dispose of other property. This made it the perfect hiding spot for a child who was supposed to be dead. For 3 days and 3 nights, baby Ruth lived among the graves of those who had died before her. Hattie and 2 other women took turns sneaking out to feed her, using rags soaked in goat's milk, because Josephine could not come without arousing suspicion. They covered the baby's mouth when she cried, terrified that someone would hear and discover their deception. They prayed over her, asking God to protect this child who had done nothing wrong except be born with the wrong color eyes. And on the 4th night, when a slave trader passed through the area on his way to Vicksburg, they found a way to smuggle Ruth off the Hargrove plantation forever. The trader's name was Samuel Meeks, and he was exactly the kind of man that most enslaved people feared. He bought and sold human beings the way other men bought and sold livestock, calculating prices based on age and health and potential productivity. But Meeks also had a reputation for accepting bribes, for looking the other way when the paperwork did not quite match the merchandise, for facilitating transactions that plantation owners preferred to keep unofficial. Hattie had saved for years, hiding coins that she earned from selling eggs and vegetables to travelers passing through the area. She gave Meeks everything she had, nearly $12, in exchange for taking the baby and selling her to a plantation far enough away that no one would ever connect her to the Hargroves. Ruth was sold 3 times before her first birthday. She passed through the hands of traders in Vicksburg, then Natchez, then finally New Orleans, where she was purchased as part of a lot by a man named William Thornton. Thornton owned a cotton plantation called Magnolia Grove in Madison County, Mississippi, about 90 miles north of where Ruth had been born. He had bought the infant not because he wanted her specifically, but because she came bundled with a group of other enslaved people he was acquiring to expand his labor force. The bill of sale listed her simply as female infant, approximately 4 months, good health, no distinguishing marks. Her blue eyes were not mentioned. Her origins were not known. Her connection to the Hargrove plantation had been erased. Ruth spent her early childhood in the slave quarters of Magnolia Grove, raised by an older woman named Bessie, who had lost her own children to sale years earlier. Bessie was the one who gave her the name Ruth, taken from the Bible story of the woman who had said, "Where you go, I will go." It was a name of loyalty and devotion. And Bessie hoped that it would bring the child luck in a world where enslaved people needed all the luck they could find. She noticed early that Ruth was different from other children. The girl was quiet, watchful, absorbing everything around her with those strange blue eyes that made some people uncomfortable and others suspicious. She rarely cried. She rarely complained, she observed. By the time Ruth was 5 years old, Bessie had realized that the child's mind worked in ways that she had never seen before. Ruth could remember conversations word for word, even conversations that had happened weeks earlier. She could count without being taught, adding and subtracting numbers that most enslaved children never learned to manipulate. She could predict when the overseer would make his rounds, somehow understanding the patterns of his behavior better than adults who had lived on the plantation for decades. And most remarkably, she had taught herself to read. No one knew how this had happened. Enslaved people were forbidden from learning to read under Mississippi law. The punishment for teaching a slave to read was severe, and the punishment for a slave caught reading was even worse. Whipping, branding, mutilation, death. These were the consequences that awaited anyone who dared to give enslaved people access to the written word. Yet somehow, at 5 years old, Ruth could look at the newspapers that blew across the yard and understand the words printed on them. She could read the signs posted around the plantation, the labels on boxes, the names carved into tools. She had decoded the mystery of language entirely on her own through observation and pattern recognition, and a mind that refused to accept limitations. Bessie understood immediately that this ability was both a gift and a death sentence. If the wrong people discovered that Ruth could read, the child would be destroyed. Not just punished, destroyed, made an example of, because the slaveholders could not afford to let other enslaved people see that one of their own had acquired knowledge without permission. It would challenge everything they believed about the inferiority of black people. It would suggest that enslaved people were capable of learning, of thinking, of becoming something more than property. So Bessie taught Ruth the most important lesson of her young life. She taught her to hide. Ruth learned to pretend that she was ordinary. She learned to look confused when white people spoke about things she understood perfectly. She learned to stumble over simple tasks that she could have completed with ease. She learned to make herself invisible, unremarkable, forgettable. This was the strategy that would keep her alive. This was the mask she would wear for years. And she wore it so well that when she was 7 years old and brought to work in the big house of Magnolia Grove, no one suspected that the quiet girl who cleaned floors and emptied chamber pots was smarter than anyone in the building. The mistress of Magnolia Grove was a woman named Caroline Thornton, and she was unlike any white woman Ruth had ever encountered. Caroline was 43 years old when Ruth came to work in the big house. She had been married to William Thornton for 22 years and had given him 5 children, 3 of whom had survived to adulthood. She managed the domestic operations of the plantation with efficiency and precision, keeping detailed records of every expenditure, every purchase, every transaction that passed through her household. She was educated, having attended a female academy in Charleston before her marriage, and she read voraciously, ordering books from publishers in Philadelphia and New York that took months to arrive by mail. Caroline noticed Ruth almost immediately. There was something about the way the girl moved through the house, the way her eyes tracked conversations, the way she positioned herself to overhear discussions that should not have concerned her. Caroline began watching Ruth the way Ruth watched everyone else, and what she discovered fascinated her. The girl was listening, not just hearing, but actively listening, processing, understanding. When Caroline discussed household accounts with her husband, Ruth's eyes would flicker toward the numbers on the page. When Caroline read letters aloud, Ruth's lips would move almost imperceptibly, following the words. When Caroline left books lying open on tables, Ruth would linger nearby, her gaze fixed on the text. Caroline decided to test her suspicions. She left a note on her dressing table, a simple message that read, "If you can read this, touch the blue vase." Then she hid and watched. Ruth entered the room to collect laundry, as she did every morning. She saw the note, she read it, and after a moment of hesitation, she touched the blue vase. The discovery changed everything. Caroline should have reported Ruth to her husband. She should have had the girl punished according to the law. She should have made an example of her, demonstrating to every enslaved person on the plantation what happened when they acquired forbidden knowledge. That was what society expected. That was what the system demanded. But Caroline Thornton was not entirely a creature of her society. She was curious. She was intelligent. And she was bored beyond measure by the narrow life that plantation mistresses were expected to lead. She began meeting with Ruth in secret. She tested the girl's abilities systematically, presenting her with increasingly difficult texts and mathematical problems. She discovered that Ruth could not only read, but could comprehend complex arguments, could analyze information, could draw conclusions from evidence. The girl's mind was extraordinary, perhaps genius level, by any standard. Caroline had never encountered anyone, white or black, male or female, with such raw intellectual capacity, and she began to wonder what would happen if she cultivated that capacity instead of destroying it. The partnership that developed between Caroline Thornton and Ruth was unprecedented and dangerous. On the surface, nothing changed. Ruth continued to work as a house slave, performing the same menial tasks she had always performed. But in private, Caroline began educating her systematically. She taught Ruth advanced mathematics, including the accounting methods she used to manage the plantation's finances. She gave Ruth access to books on history, geography, science, philosophy. She trained Ruth to analyze documents, to detect inconsistencies, to identify patterns that others missed. Within 2 years, Ruth understood the Thornton plantation's operations better than William Thornton himself. Caroline began using Ruth's abilities for her own purposes. She had long suspected that the overseer was stealing from the plantation, skimming profits from cotton sales, and falsifying expense reports. But she had never been able to prove it because she lacked the time and expertise to audit years of records. Ruth accomplished in 3 weeks what Caroline could not have done in 3 years. She cross-referenced sales receipts with shipping manifests, identified discrepancies between reported and actual production, traced payments to vendors who did not exist. She documented everything in a report that Caroline presented to William, and the overseer was dismissed within a month. This success convinced Caroline that Ruth was too valuable to waste on domestic labor. She began deploying Ruth as a secret weapon in the Thorntons' business affairs. When William received correspondence from cotton factors in New Orleans, Ruth would read the letters and identify potential deceptions. When neighbors proposed business partnerships, Ruth would analyze the terms and calculate whether the deals were truly advantageous. When disputes arose over property lines or water rights, Ruth would research the legal precedents and suggest strategies for resolution. All of this was done invisibly. No one outside the household knew that the Thorntons' improved business acumen was actually the work of a teenage enslaved girl. The arrangement continued for nearly a decade. Ruth grew from a child into a young woman, and her abilities grew with her. By the time she was 17 years old, in the spring of 1849, she had become indispensable to the operation of Magnolia Grove. She managed the household accounts. She drafted correspondence that Caroline signed with her own name. She maintained files on every business associate, every neighbor, every person who might affect the Thorntons' interests. She knew secrets that could destroy families. She understood financial arrangements that even the parties involved did not fully comprehend. She had transformed herself from property into something far more valuable. But she was still property, and that contradiction was about to catch up with her. Caroline Thornton fell ill in March of 1849. The doctors called it a cancer of the womb, a diagnosis that carried an inevitable prognosis. There were treatments available, painful procedures involving caustic chemicals and heated instruments. But everyone understood that these treatments merely delayed the end. Caroline bore her illness with the stoic dignity that plantation mistresses were expected to display. She continued managing her household until she could no longer rise from bed. She continued directing Ruth's work until she could no longer speak clearly. And she died on May 15, 1849, leaving behind a grieving husband, 3 adult children, and a 17-year-old enslaved girl who had been her secret partner for 10 years. William Thornton was 58 years old when his wife died. He was a practical man, not given to excessive emotion. But Caroline's death affected him more deeply than he had anticipated. They had not married for love. Their union had been an arrangement between families, a merging of land and resources that benefited both parties. But over 22 years, something resembling love had developed between them. He had relied on her judgment. He had trusted her management. He had never realized how much of the plantation's success was due to her efforts rather than his own. In the weeks following Caroline's death, William began the process of settling her affairs. He reviewed her correspondence, her financial records, her personal papers. He wanted to understand her world, the domestic realm that he had largely ignored during their marriage. And in the process of this review, he discovered something that changed everything he thought he knew about his wife. He found the files on Ruth. Caroline had kept meticulous records of Ruth's education, her accomplishments, her contributions to the plantation's business operations. She had documented everything, perhaps intending to eventually share this information with William, perhaps simply unable to resist her habit of thorough record-keeping. The files contained Ruth's analyses of business deals, her audits of financial records, her strategic recommendations. They revealed that for nearly a decade, the most important decisions at Magnolia Grove had been influenced by the insights of an enslaved girl who was legally forbidden from reading. William's reaction was not what Caroline might have hoped. He did not admire Ruth's abilities. He did not appreciate her contributions. He felt betrayed. He felt humiliated. He felt afraid. His wife had been deceiving him for years, relying on a slave for intellectual guidance, while he believed himself to be the master of his own domain. His business partners had been negotiating not with him, but with a black girl hiding behind the facade of his authority. Everything he had accomplished was tainted by this revelation, and there was another fear, deeper and more primal than wounded pride. Ruth knew too much. She had seen the Thorntons' financial records, their correspondence, their private negotiations. She knew about debts that William had concealed from creditors. She knew about deals that had been structured to evade taxes. She knew about arrangements with neighboring planters that would cause scandal if revealed. She knew secrets that could destroy the Thornton family's reputation and fortune. An enslaved person with this knowledge was not an asset. She was a threat, a liability, a danger that had to be eliminated. But William could not simply kill her. Too many people knew she existed. The household staff had seen her working closely with Caroline. The other enslaved people knew that she held a special position. If Ruth suddenly disappeared, there would be questions. There might be investigations. There could be consequences that William preferred to avoid. He needed a solution that would remove Ruth permanently without raising suspicion. He needed her to die in a way that appeared natural, expected, unremarkable. He needed to send her somewhere that people did not return from. He found his answer in Louisiana. The sugar plantations of Louisiana were notorious throughout the South. Cotton was brutal, but sugar was death. The labor required to cultivate and process sugar cane was so intense, so physically devastating, that enslaved people sent to sugar plantations had an average life expectancy of 7 years from arrival. The work began before dawn and continued past midnight during the grinding season. The heat from the boiling houses could reach temperatures that caused permanent damage to workers' lungs and eyes. The machines that processed the cane maimed and killed with terrifying regularity. Plantation owners calculated that it was cheaper to work slaves to death and buy replacements than to treat them humanly and preserve their health. A healthy 17-year-old girl sent to a Louisiana sugar plantation would not survive long. She would be worked past the point of exhaustion. She would be exposed to diseases that thrived in the humid climate. She would be fed barely enough to sustain life, and within a year, probably less, she would die. No one would question it. No one would investigate. It would simply be the expected outcome of the slave system operating as designed. William began making arrangements. He contacted a slave broker in Natchez who specialized in moving human property between states. He negotiated a price, accepting far less than Ruth was worth because his goal was disposal rather than profit. He scheduled the sale for September 15, 1849, giving himself time to manage the transaction discreetly. And he told no one what he was planning, because secrecy was essential to his scheme. But William made a critical mistake. He underestimated Ruth. She knew something was wrong from the moment William discovered the files. She had watched him carefully during the weeks following Caroline's death, reading his expressions, analyzing his behavior, trying to understand what he would do with the knowledge he had acquired. She saw the fear in his eyes when he looked at her. She saw the calculation, the cold assessment of a man deciding how to dispose of a problem. She recognized the signs because Caroline had taught her to recognize them in business negotiations. William was planning something, and whatever he was planning, it would not be good for Ruth. She needed information. She needed to know exactly what William intended, so that she could develop a counter-strategy. And she had the skills to get that information, because Caroline had trained her well. Ruth began her reconnaissance in late August, 3 weeks before the scheduled sale. She had access to William's study, because she was still responsible for cleaning it. A duty that no one had thought to reassign after Caroline's death. She used this access to examine his correspondence, his financial records, his calendar of appointments. She did this carefully, methodically, leaving no trace of her intrusion. She photographed nothing, because cameras did not exist for people in her position. She copied nothing because written evidence could be discovered. She memorized everything, relying on the extraordinary memory that had served her throughout her life. What she discovered confirmed her worst fears. William had arranged to sell her to a broker named James Patterson, who operated out of Natchez and specialized in bulk sales to Louisiana sugar plantations. The transaction was scheduled for September 15th. Patterson would arrive at Magnolia Grove that morning, inspect the merchandise, complete the paperwork, and transport Ruth to Louisiana before sunset. By the end of the month, she would be working in the sugar fields. By the end of the year, she would likely be dead. Ruth had 17 days to save her own life. The first thing she did was assess her resources. She had no money. She had no allies among the white population. She had no legal rights of any kind. She could not appeal to authorities, because the law considered her property, not a person. She could not simply run because fugitive slave catchers operated throughout the region, and an escaped slave was worth money to anyone who captured her. She could not fight because physical resistance would result in immediate punishment and would not change her legal status. Every conventional avenue of escape was closed to her. But Ruth had something that most enslaved people did not have. She had information. She had spent 10 years accumulating knowledge about the Thorntons, their neighbors, their business partners, their enemies. She knew secrets that powerful men wanted kept hidden. She understood relationships and rivalries that could be exploited. She saw connections that others missed, and she was willing to use all of this knowledge to survive. The plan she developed over the following days was extraordinarily complex. It required manipulating multiple people simultaneously, predicting their reactions, steering them toward outcomes that served her purposes. It required perfect timing and absolute secrecy. It required Ruth to think several moves ahead, like a chess player, anticipating her opponent's strategies. And it required her to take risks that could result in her death if anything went wrong. The first target was a man named Henry Crawford. Crawford owned a plantation adjacent to Magnolia Grove. He and William Thornton had been rivals for decades, competing for land, labor, and status in Madison County society. Their disputes had sometimes turned bitter, involving lawsuits over property lines and accusations of slave theft. But they maintained a facade of civility because open warfare between planters was considered unseemly. They attended the same church. They served on the same committees. They pretended to be gentlemen, even as they schemed against each other. Ruth knew things about Henry Crawford that he desperately wanted kept secret. 3 years earlier, Crawford had entered into a business arrangement with a cotton factor in New Orleans that had resulted in significant financial losses. To cover these losses, Crawford had engaged in fraudulent transactions, forging documents and deceiving creditors. Ruth knew about this because Caroline had discovered it during her investigations, and Ruth had helped analyze the evidence. The information had been filed away, never used because Caroline had seen no advantage in exposing Crawford while she was alive. But Ruth saw an advantage now. She began by sending Crawford an anonymous letter. She could not mail it through conventional channels because enslaved people were not permitted to use the postal system. Instead, she arranged for the letter to be delivered through a free black man who worked as a tinker, traveling between plantations to repair pots and sharpen knives. She paid him with a piece of jewelry that she had stolen from Caroline's belongings months earlier, hidden away for precisely this kind of emergency. The tinker delivered the letter to Crawford's plantation and disappeared before anyone could question him. The letter was carefully crafted. It did not threaten Crawford directly. It did not demand money or favors. It simply informed him that someone possessed evidence of his fraudulent transactions and suggested that this evidence might become public if certain conditions were not met. The conditions were vague, deliberately so. Ruth wanted Crawford frightened and uncertain. She wanted him looking for enemies, suspecting everyone around him, making mistakes that she could exploit. Crawford's reaction was exactly what Ruth had anticipated. He became paranoid. He began investigating his household staff, his business partners, his neighbors. He suspected that someone close to him had betrayed his secrets, and he was determined to discover who. This investigation distracted him from other concerns and created chaos that Ruth could use. The second target was William Thornton himself. Ruth knew that William's plan to sell her depended on secrecy. He did not want his neighbors to know that he was disposing of a slave who had been his wife's personal attendant. He did not want anyone asking questions about why a healthy young woman was being sent to the death camps of Louisiana. He needed the transaction to appear routine, unremarkable, forgettable. Ruth decided to make it remarkable. She began spreading information through the enslaved community at Magnolia Grove. She told other house servants that Master William was planning to sell her, that he was sending her to Louisiana, that he was doing this to punish her for something she had not done. The servants talked among themselves, as servants always do. They expressed sympathy for Ruth, who had been a quiet and helpful presence in the household. They wondered why Master William would send away someone who had served Miss Caroline so faithfully. These conversations reached the ears of white people, as Ruth knew they would. Plantation mistresses heard gossip from their maids. Overseers heard rumors from drivers. Within a week, the pending sale of Ruth had become a subject of discussion throughout Madison County. People were curious about why William Thornton was disposing of a valuable slave at a discount price. People were asking questions that William had hoped to avoid. This attention made William uncomfortable. He had wanted the sale to be invisible, and instead it was becoming a topic of local gossip. He began to worry that someone might investigate, that his reasons for selling Ruth might be discovered, that his secrets might be exposed. He became cautious, hesitant, uncertain. He postponed some of his preparations for the sale, giving Ruth additional time to execute her plan. The third target was the most dangerous. His name was James Patterson, and he was the slave broker who would transport Ruth to Louisiana. Patterson was a professional. He had been trading in human beings for 20 years, and he had learned to evaluate enslaved people the way horse traders evaluated livestock. He looked for signs of illness, injury, disability. He looked for scars that indicated punishment, which might suggest a troublesome temperament. He looked for evidence of value that might allow him to demand higher prices from his buyers. He was not easily fooled, and he was not sentimental about his merchandise. Ruth understood that she could not manipulate Patterson directly. He had no secrets that she knew of, no leverage that she could apply. But she could affect the conditions under which he operated. She could change the context of the transaction in ways that might alter its outcome. She discovered that Patterson had a competitor, another broker named Thomas Reed, who operated out of Vicksburg, and the two men had been feuding for years over territory and clients. They undercut each other's prices, spread rumors about each other's reliability, and occasionally resorted to more direct forms of sabotage. The rivalry was well known in the slave trading community, though most plantation owners were unaware of its intensity. Ruth sent a second anonymous letter, this time to Thomas Reed. She informed him that James Patterson was planning a significant purchase at Magnolia Grove on September 15th, that the transaction would include several valuable slaves, and that Patterson had been boasting about stealing clients from Reed's territory. The letter was designed to provoke Reed into action, to create conflict between the two brokers that would disrupt the planned sale. Reed responded exactly as Ruth had hoped. He arrived at Magnolia Grove on September 10th, 5 days before Patterson was scheduled to appear. He presented himself to William Thornton as a reputable broker offering competitive prices, and he suggested that William might want to consider alternatives before committing to any particular transaction. His arrival confused William, who had not expected competition for a sale he had tried to keep secret. It raised questions about how Reed had learned of the pending transaction. It created uncertainty that William found deeply unsettling. While William was distracted by Reed's unexpected appearance, Ruth executed the next phase of her plan. She had been collecting documents for weeks. Copies of correspondence, financial records, evidence of the Thorntons' business dealings over the past decade. She had hidden these documents in locations throughout the plantation, places where they could be retrieved if needed. Now, she began deploying them strategically. The first document went to a lawyer in Vicksburg named Samuel Morrison. Morrison had represented the Thorntons in several legal matters over the years, but he had also represented Henry Crawford in the property dispute that had nearly gone to court. He had access to both families' secrets, and he was known for his discretion. Ruth sent him an anonymous package containing evidence of irregularities in the Thorntons' financial records. Irregularities that suggested possible fraud. The package included a note suggesting that Morrison might want to investigate before his reputation became entangled with scandal. Morrison did not investigate immediately, but he began asking questions, making inquiries, expressing concerns about certain transactions that he had previously approved without scrutiny. These questions reached William through various channels, adding to his growing sense that something was wrong, that forces were moving against him, that his carefully constructed plans were unraveling. The second document went to the county sheriff, a man named Robert Blackwell. Blackwell was not corrupt, which was unusual for law enforcement in antebellum Mississippi. He took his duties seriously and had a reputation for enforcing the law, even when powerful planters preferred that he look the other way. Ruth sent him evidence of the fraudulent transactions that Henry Crawford had conducted 3 years earlier, framing it as the work of a concerned citizen who could not stand by while crimes went unpunished. Blackwell opened an investigation. He began questioning Crawford's business partners, examining records, following the trail of evidence that Ruth had provided. Crawford, already paranoid from the anonymous letter he had received, became convinced that William Thornton was behind the investigation. He believed that his neighbor was using the legal system to destroy him, and he began preparing his own counterattack. The conflict between Crawford and Thornton, which Ruth had deliberately inflamed, now threatened to consume both men. They accused each other of betrayal, of conspiracy, of crimes that neither had actually committed against the other. Their mutual suspicion created chaos throughout Madison County, distracting everyone from the quiet enslaved girl who was orchestrating events from the shadows. On September 12th, 3 days before the scheduled sale, the situation exploded. Henry Crawford rode to Magnolia Grove with 3 armed men. He demanded to see William Thornton. He accused William of orchestrating the investigation against him, of trying to destroy his reputation, of violating the unwritten rules that governed relations between plantation owners. The confrontation took place on the front lawn of the big house, witnessed by dozens of enslaved workers and several white visitors who happened to be present. William denied everything. He had no idea what Crawford was talking about. He had not sent any letters, had not contacted any lawyers, had not informed any sheriffs. He was as confused by the investigation as Crawford was. But Crawford did not believe him. The two men argued, their voices rising, their hands moving toward weapons. For a moment, it seemed that blood would be spilled. It was at this moment that Ruth made her move. She stepped forward from the crowd of watching slaves. She walked toward the two angry men with a calm deliberation that made everyone stop and stare. Enslaved people did not insert themselves into disputes between white men. Enslaved people did not approach armed planters who were on the verge of violence. What Ruth did was so unprecedented, so unexpected, that both Crawford and Thornton fell silent in sheer surprise. Ruth spoke. For the first time in her life, she spoke to white men as something other than property. She spoke with the confidence of someone who held power, even though the law said she had none. She told them that she knew who had sent the letters. She knew who had informed the sheriff. She knew who had orchestrated the chaos that was consuming both their families. And she was willing to share this information, but only on certain conditions. The conditions were simple. Ruth wanted her freedom. She wanted legal documentation of her emancipation, signed by William Thornton and witnessed by Henry Crawford. She wanted safe passage out of Mississippi, guaranteed by both men. And she wanted it immediately, before the sun set on September 12, 1849. Both men laughed. The idea that an enslaved person could make demands was absurd. The idea that two plantation owners would grant freedom to a slave who had caused them so much trouble was unthinkable. They would simply beat the information out of her, they said. They would torture her until she revealed everything she knew. They would make an example of her that would be remembered for generations. Ruth did not flinch. She told them that she had prepared for this possibility. She told them that documents were hidden in locations throughout the county, documents that would be delivered to newspapers, lawyers, and government officials if she did not return safely to a specific location by sunset. She told them that these documents contained evidence of crimes committed by both men, evidence that would result in prosecution, imprisonment, and financial ruin. She told them that she was not bluffing, and she invited them to test her if they doubted her resolve. There was a long silence. Crawford and Thornton looked at each other, seeing their own fear reflected in the other's eyes. They had spent years accumulating secrets, building fortunes on foundations of fraud and exploitation. They had believed themselves untouchable, protected by wealth and status and the color of their skin. And now a 17-year-old enslaved girl was threatening to bring it all crashing down. William Thornton spoke first. He asked Ruth what guarantee he had that she would not release the documents even after receiving her freedom. He asked how he could trust someone who had already demonstrated such capacity for deception. He asked what would prevent her from destroying him once she was beyond his control. Ruth answered honestly. She said that she had no interest in revenge. She had no desire to see either man imprisoned or impoverished. She simply wanted to live. She wanted to be free. She wanted to walk away from Magnolia Grove and never look back. If they gave her freedom, she would disappear. She would take her secrets with her, and she would never speak of them again. But if they refused, if they tried to harm her, if they sold her to Louisiana as William had planned, then she would ensure that they suffered consequences far worse than anything she had experienced. The negotiation that followed lasted 3 hours. It took place in William Thornton's study, with Ruth seated across from the two men who had enslaved and terrorized people like her for their entire lives. They bargained over terms. They argued about guarantees. They threatened and cajoled and ultimately surrendered to the reality that Ruth had outmaneuvered them. At sunset on September 12, 1849, Ruth walked out of Magnolia Grove as a free woman. She carried papers documenting her emancipation, signed by William Thornton and witnessed by Henry Crawford. She carried a small amount of money that she had demanded as part of the negotiation, and she carried the knowledge that she had accomplished something that the entire system of slavery was designed to prevent. She had freed herself. The road from Magnolia Grove led south toward Vicksburg, then west across the Mississippi River into Louisiana, then further west into Texas, and eventually into Mexico, where slavery did not exist, and where a black woman with blue eyes might find something resembling safety. Ruth knew this route because she had studied maps in Caroline Thornton's library, memorizing geography the way she memorized everything else, storing information that might someday prove useful. She had not known then that she would need to flee for her life. She had simply been curious, hungry for knowledge, unable to resist learning even when the knowledge served no immediate purpose. Now, that curiosity might save her, but freedom on paper was not the same as freedom in practice. Ruth understood this as she walked away from the plantation that had been her prison for 17 years. The documents she carried meant nothing to the slave catchers who roamed the roads of Mississippi, men who earned their living by capturing black people and returning them to bondage. These men did not examine papers carefully. They did not give accused runaways the benefit of the doubt. They seized first and asked questions later, knowing that even a free black person could be sold back into slavery if no one came forward to vouch for their status. The legal system was designed to favor slaveholders, to assume that any black person without a white protector was property that had wandered from its owner. Ruth had anticipated this danger. She had planned her escape route carefully, identifying safe houses where she might find shelter, calculating distances between towns, estimating how far she could travel before exhaustion forced her to stop. She had also prepared contingencies, alternative plans that she could implement if her primary route became impossible. The months of preparation that had gone into her confrontation with Thornton and Crawford had also produced a deal strategy for survival after that confrontation succeeded. The first night of freedom was the most dangerous. Ruth needed to put as much distance as possible between herself and Magnolia Grove before William Thornton could change his mind, before he could decide that the risk of her documents was worth less than the satisfaction of recapturing her, before he could send men to hunt her down and drag her back to face punishment for her audacity. She walked through the darkness, following paths that she had mapped in her mind, avoiding main roads where patrols might spot her, moving with a speed and determination that surprised even herself. By dawn, she had covered nearly 15 miles. Her feet were blistered and bleeding. Her body ached from exertion. But she was alive, and she was free, and every step took her further from the life she had been forced to endure. She found shelter in an abandoned barn near the town of Canton, hiding in the hayloft while she rested and planned her next move. She slept fitfully, waking at every sound, terrified that someone would discover her hiding place. But no one came. The barn remained silent, except for the rustling of mice and the distant sounds of farm animals beginning their day. She resumed walking at sunset, traveling through another night of darkness and uncertainty. The second day brought her to the outskirts of Vicksburg, a city that sat on bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River. Vicksburg was a hub of commerce and slave trading, one of the busiest ports in the region. Thousands of enslaved people passed through its markets every year, bought and sold like livestock, shipped upriver and downriver to plantations throughout the South. It was a dangerous place for a black woman traveling alone, but it was also a necessary waypoint on Ruth's journey to freedom. She had a contact in Vicksburg, a free black man named Solomon Burke, who operated a small barbershop near the waterfront. Solomon was part of an informal network that helped escaped slaves navigate the dangerous territory between bondage and liberty. He was not connected to the organized Underground Railroad, which operated primarily in the Upper South and the North. He was simply a man who believed that freedom was worth fighting for, and who used his position in the community to assist those who sought it. Ruth had learned about Solomon through the enslaved grapevine, the invisible communication network that connected black communities across the region. She had memorized his address months earlier, adding it to the store of information that she carried in her remarkable mind. Finding Solomon's barbershop required navigating streets filled with white people who might question why a young black woman was walking alone without supervision. Ruth adopted a persona that she had developed during her years of hiding her true abilities. She hunched her shoulders slightly, kept her eyes downcast, moved with the shuffling gait of someone who had been broken by years of hard labor. She made herself look harmless, unremarkable, not worth a second glance. This performance had protected her throughout her childhood, and it protected her now as she made her way through the crowded streets of Vicksburg. Solomon Burke was a large man in his 50s with gray hair and hands that had been scarred by decades of working with razors and hot water. He received Ruth cautiously, examining her papers with the skeptical eye of someone who had seen many forged documents over the years. But the papers were genuine, signed by William Thornton in his own hand, witnessed by Henry Crawford, dated just 2 days earlier. Solomon had never seen legitimate emancipation papers for someone so young, someone who showed no signs of the injuries or illnesses that sometimes prompted owners to free slaves who had become unprofitable to maintain. He was curious about her story, but he was also wise enough not to ask questions that she might not want to answer. He offered her shelter in a room behind his barber shop, a small space that had hidden many travelers before her. He provided food and water and advice about the journey ahead. He warned her about the dangers she would face, the slave catchers who prowled the roads, the sheriffs who arrested free blacks on pretexts and sold them back into slavery, the ordinary white people who might report a suspicious traveler simply out of malice or greed. He told her that the route to Mexico was long and treacherous, that many who attempted it did not survive, that she should consider whether death on the road might be worse than the life she was fleeing. Ruth listened to Solomon's warnings, but she did not waver in her determination. She had not risked everything to gain her freedom, only to surrender it now. She had not spent months planning her escape, only to abandon the plan at the first sign of difficulty. She thanked Solomon for his help and his honesty, and she asked him what she needed to know to survive the next stage of her journey. Solomon told her about a steamboat captain named Marcus Wheeler who operated a packet boat between Vicksburg and New Orleans. Wheeler was not an abolitionist. He was not motivated by moral conviction or religious faith. He was simply a businessman who had discovered that transporting certain passengers could be profitable if done discreetly. He charged high prices for his services, but he delivered his cargo safely, and he asked no questions about origins or destinations. Ruth had money from her negotiation with Thornton, enough to pay Wheeler's fee, with some leftover for the journey ahead. The meeting with Wheeler took place at midnight on the Vicksburg waterfront. The captain was a weathered man in his 40s with the permanent squint of someone who spent his life staring into sun and wind. He examined Ruth's papers briefly, more interested in her money than her legal status. He quoted a price that was nearly double what Solomon had estimated. But Ruth had anticipated this, and had hidden reserves that she revealed only when necessary. She paid Wheeler half in advance, with the other half promised upon safe arrival in New Orleans. The journey downriver took 3 days. Ruth spent most of that time hidden in a compartment below the main deck, a cramped space that had been modified to conceal passengers who preferred not to be seen. She was not alone in the compartment. 2 other travelers shared the space with her, a man named Frederick, who had escaped from a plantation in Tennessee, and a woman named Clara, who had purchased her own freedom after years of saving, and was now fleeing a former owner who disputed the validity of her papers. They did not speak much during the journey. There was little to say, and silence was safer than conversation that might be overheard. New Orleans was unlike anything Ruth had ever experienced. The city was vast and chaotic, a swirling mix of cultures and languages that overwhelmed her senses after the rural isolation of Madison County. French and Spanish and English blended together in the streets. Free people of color walked openly, operating businesses, owning property, living lives that would have been impossible in Mississippi. Enslaved people moved through the city alongside their owners, some appearing almost as well, dressed as the whites they served, others bearing the marks of brutal treatment that Ruth recognized from her own experience. The city was a contradiction, a place where slavery coexisted with a significant free black population, where the lines between bondage and liberty were sometimes blurred in ways that Ruth found both hopeful and confusing. She did not linger in New Orleans. The city might be more tolerant than the Mississippi countryside, but it was still dangerous for a young black woman traveling alone. Slave traders operated openly in the markets, and kidnappers targeted free blacks, who might be sold before anyone noticed their disappearance. Ruth used the contacts that Solomon had provided to find passage on a ship heading west along the Gulf Coast toward Texas and eventually Mexico. The ship was a coastal trader carrying cotton and sugar to markets in Galveston. Its captain was a Yankee from Massachusetts who had no particular feelings about slavery, but who was willing to transport paying passengers, regardless of their color. Ruth paid for her passage with the last of her money from the Thornton negotiation, calculating that she would need to find work once she reached Texas, that her resources would not last indefinitely, that survival would require more than just escape. The voyage along the Gulf Coast took 2 weeks. Ruth spent the time learning everything she could about Texas and Mexico, questioning sailors and fellow passengers about conditions in the territories ahead. She learned that Texas had been an independent republic before joining the United States in 1845, that slavery was legal there and expanding rapidly as cotton cultivation spread westward, that the Mexican border was porous and poorly guarded, that thousands of escaped slaves had found freedom by crossing into territory where bondage did not exist. She learned the names of towns near the border, the routes that other refugees had followed, the dangers that awaited those who attempted the crossing. She also learned about the Fugitive Slave Act that Congress was debating in Washington, the law, which would eventually pass in 1850, would require citizens throughout the United States to assist in the capture of escaped slaves, would deny accused fugitives the right to trial by jury, would impose severe penalties on anyone who aided runaways. The law had not yet passed when Ruth made her journey, but its approach cast a shadow over everyone fleeing bondage. Even if she reached Mexico, she would never be truly safe as long as the United States existed in its current form. The slave power reached everywhere, corrupting laws, buying politicians, ensuring that no black person could ever feel secure. The ship landed at Galveston on October 3, 1849. Ruth had been traveling for 3 weeks, had covered hundreds of miles by foot and steamboat and sailing vessel, had passed through territories where she could have been captured and returned to slavery at any moment. She was exhausted and frightened and uncertain about what lay ahead. But she was also alive. She was also free, and she was closer to permanent safety than she had ever been before. Galveston was a young city, barely 2 decades old. Built on a barrier island in the Gulf of Mexico, it served as the primary port for the Republic of Texas, and later the state, handling the cotton and other goods that flowed from the interior to markets around the world. The city had a small free black population, mostly skilled workers who had arrived from other parts of the South. And Ruth found temporary shelter with a family that Solomon Burke had recommended through his network of contacts. She stayed in Galveston for 2 weeks, resting and recovering from the physical toll of her journey. During this time, she began to understand that her escape was not complete, that dangers remained that she had not fully anticipated. Word of her departure from Magnolia Grove had spread through the networks that connected slaveholders across the South. William Thornton had not sent men to pursue her as she had feared. He had done something worse. He had placed advertisements in newspapers throughout the region, offering a reward for information about a runaway slave matching her description, claiming that her freedom papers were forged, asserting that she remained his lawful property, despite the documents she carried. The advertisements were lies. Ruth's papers were genuine, signed under duress perhaps, but legally valid nonetheless. But the truth mattered less than the perception, and the perception was that a significant reward awaited anyone who captured the blue-eyed black girl and returned her to Mississippi. Slave catchers began looking for her. Local authorities began paying attention to young black women traveling alone. The protection that her freedom papers should have provided was undermined by Thornton's campaign of disinformation. Ruth realized that she needed to change her plans. She could not travel openly to the Mexican border. She could not rely on the established routes that other refugees had followed. She needed to disappear, to become someone else, to shed the identity that Thornton was using to hunt her. She needed to do what she had always done best. She needed to become invisible. The transformation began with her appearance. Ruth's most distinctive feature was her blue eyes, the characteristic that had marked her for death at birth, and that now made her easy to identify. She could not change her eye color, but she could make it less noticeable. She obtained a pair of spectacles with darkened lenses, the kind that people with sensitive eyes sometimes wore to protect against sunlight. The glasses obscured her eyes enough that casual observers wouldn't notice their unusual color. They also changed her appearance significantly, making her look older and more scholarly, less like the description that was circulating in the wanted advertisements. She changed her name as well. She became Sarah Johnson, a common name that would not attract attention, an identity that had no connection to the Ruth who had escaped from Magnolia Grove. She practiced speaking with a different accent, adopting the patterns of free blacks from New Orleans rather than the Mississippi countryside. She modified her posture, her walk, her mannerisms, becoming someone new in every way that she could control. The new identity required documentation. Ruth could not use the freedom papers that Thornton had signed because those papers identified her as Ruth and would connect her to the wanted advertisements. She needed new papers, documents that would establish Sarah Johnson as a free woman of color with a legitimate history and a legal right to travel. Obtaining such documents was illegal, but it was not impossible. Forgery was a thriving industry in the antebellum South, serving everyone from escaped slaves seeking freedom to white criminals seeking new identities. Ruth found a forger in Galveston who produced papers that would pass all but the most rigorous inspection. Papers that established Sarah Johnson as a seamstress from New Orleans, traveling to visit relatives in San Antonio. With her new identity established, Ruth resumed her journey toward Mexico. She traveled by stagecoach from Galveston to Houston, then by wagon train from Houston toward San Antonio. The journey was slow and uncomfortable, covering territory that was still raw frontier, passing through settlements that were barely more than collections of shacks and saloons. But the frontier had advantages for someone in Ruth's situation. People on the frontier asked fewer questions. They cared less about origins and more about whether a person could work, could contribute, could survive the harsh conditions that awaited everyone in this unforgiving land. She reached San Antonio in early November. The city was a mix of Mexican and American influences, a place where Spanish was spoken as often as English, and where the recent war between the United States and Mexico had left lingering tensions between the two populations. The Mexican border lay just 150 miles to the south, across territory that was disputed and dangerous, but passable for someone determined enough to attempt the crossing. Ruth could see her destination. She could almost touch freedom, but she had learned enough by now to know that the final miles of any journey were often the most dangerous. She found work in San Antonio as a laundress, one of the few occupations open to black women in the frontier city. The work was hard and the pay was poor, but it allowed her to save money for the final leg of her journey, while maintaining the cover identity she had constructed. She lived in a small room behind the laundry, kept to herself, spoke to no one about her true origins or her plans for the future. She had become Sarah Johnson so completely that sometimes she forgot that Ruth had ever existed. But Ruth had not forgotten. Ruth was still there beneath the surface, watching and analyzing and planning. Ruth noticed when strangers asked questions about new arrivals from the east. Ruth observed when certain men seemed to be watching the places where black people gathered. Ruth recognized the signs of organized searching, the methodical pattern of hunters closing in on their prey. They found her in December. She was working in the laundry when two white men entered and asked for Sarah Johnson. They were professional slave catchers, men who made their living hunting escaped slaves and returning them to bondage. They had been hired by William Thornton to track down the blue-eyed girl who had humiliated him, and they had followed her trail across hundreds of miles, from Mississippi to Louisiana to Texas. They did not believe she was Sarah Johnson. They did not care about her papers. They had a physical description and a substantial reward, and they intended to collect. Ruth had prepared for this moment. She had always known that running was only a temporary solution, that eventually she would have to confront the forces pursuing her. She had spent the weeks in San Antonio not just working and saving, but also planning, developing strategies for the confrontation that she knew was coming. She had identified allies and resources. She had studied the legal system of Texas, learning how it differed from the laws of Mississippi, and what protections might be available to someone in her situation. She had positioned herself to fight. The slave catchers made their first mistake by assuming that Ruth would be easy to capture. They were accustomed to taking scared and isolated runaways, people who had no resources and no support, who could be seized and transported before anyone knew what had happened. They did not expect organized resistance. They did not anticipate that this particular target had been preparing for them. Ruth's response was immediate and coordinated. She had previously established relationships with several members of San Antonio's small abolitionist community. white people and free blacks who opposed slavery, and who were willing to take risks to help those fleeing bondage. When the slave catchers arrived, Ruth's allies swung into action. A lawyer named Thomas Bennett appeared at the laundry within an hour, demanding that the catchers produce legal documentation of their authority to seize anyone. A local businessman named William Cooper filed a complaint with the sheriff, alleging that the catchers were planning to kidnap a free woman. Several witnesses came forward to testify that they had known Sarah Johnson for months and could vouch for her status as a free person. The slave catchers had not expected to face legal opposition in a slave state like Texas. They had warrants from Mississippi, but Texas law required additional documentation for capturing alleged fugitives. Documentation they did not possess. They had physical descriptions of Ruth, but Ruth had changed her appearance significantly, and the woman standing before them did not obviously match the description. They had confidence in their authority, but that confidence was being challenged by lawyers and businessmen and witnesses who seemed determined to obstruct their mission. The confrontation played out over 3 days. The slave catchers attempted to seize Ruth directly, but they were blocked by her allies and warned by the sheriff that unauthorized kidnapping would result in their arrest. They attempted to obtain additional documentation from Texas authorities, but the process was slow and complicated and seemed to encounter unusual delays at every stage. They attempted to bribe local officials, but found that key officials had already been influenced by Ruth's network of supporters. Ruth used these 3 days strategically. She knew that the slave catchers would eventually obtain the documentation they needed, that the legal obstacles could only delay them, not stop them permanently. She needed to escape before the bureaucratic barriers crumbled. She needed to reach Mexico, where American warrants had no authority and where slave catchers could not follow. On the night of December 15, 1849, Ruth fled San Antonio. She traveled with a guide, a Mexican man named Diego Reyes, who knew the territory between San Antonio and the border, and who had helped other fugitives make the crossing. They rode horses that Ruth had purchased with her savings, moving as quickly as the terrain allowed, racing against the slave catchers who would surely follow once they realized their quarry had escaped. The journey to the border took 4 days. They traveled through landscapes that Ruth had never imagined, deserts and scrublands and rocky hills that seemed to stretch forever under the vast Texas sky. They avoided roads and settlements, following trails that only Diego knew, trails that had been used by smugglers and refugees, and others who needed to move without being observed. They slept during the day and traveled at night, navigating by stars that Diego could read like a map. On December 19, 1849, they reached the Rio Grande. The river was low at this time of year, shallow enough to wade across in many places. On the other side lay Mexico, a country that had abolished slavery in 1829, a country where Ruth would finally be beyond the reach of American law and American slave catchers. She could see the far bank from where she stood, could seem the promised land that had seemed impossibly distant just months earlier, when she had been planning her escape from Magnolia Grove. But the crossing would not be simple. The slave catchers had followed more quickly than Ruth had anticipated. Diego spotted them in the distance, 3 riders moving fast along the trail that Ruth and Diego had followed. They would reach the river within an hour, possibly less. If Ruth attempted to cross now, she might not make it to the other side before they caught up. The river was wide, and the current was stronger than it appeared. A crossing on horseback would take time that Ruth might not have. Diego made a decision. He told Ruth to cross immediately, to push her horse into the water, and ride for the Mexican shore without looking back. He would stay behind to delay the pursuers, to give her the time she needed to reach safety. Ruth protested. She did not want anyone else to suffer on her behalf. She did not want Diego's blood on her hands. But Diego was adamant. He had helped many people escape to Mexico. Some had made it, some had not. He would not let Ruth become one of those who had come so close only to be captured at the final moment. Ruth entered the river. The water was cold, colder than she had expected, and the current pulled at her horse's legs with surprising force. She gripped the saddle and urged the horse forward, focusing on the opposite bank, trying not to think about what was happening behind her. She heard shouting, heard the sound of horses splashing into the river, heard a gunshot that echoed across the water. She did not look back. She kept her eyes fixed on Mexico, on freedom, on the future that she had fought so hard to reach. The crossing took approximately 15 minutes. It felt like hours. Every second, Ruth expected to feel hands grabbing at her, expected to be pulled from her horse and dragged back to American territory. But the hands never came. The slave catchers never caught up. When Ruth finally reached the Mexican shore and turned to look back, she saw Diego still in the water, his horse blocking the path of the pursuers, his body between them and their target. She never learned what happened to Diego after that. She never learned whether he survived the confrontation or whether he sacrificed his life to ensure her freedom. She searched for information in the years that followed, asked everyone she could find who might know. But Diego Reyes seemed to have vanished as completely as Ruth herself had vanished from the slave states. He became one of the countless unrecorded heroes of the struggle against slavery. A person whose courage made someone else's freedom possible and whose name was never written in the history books. Ruth crossed into Mexico on December 19, 1849. She was 17 years old. She had traveled more than 1,000 miles from the plantation where she had been enslaved. She had outwitted some of the most powerful men in Mississippi. She had survived slave catchers and bounty hunters and a legal system designed to ensure that people like her could never escape. And now, standing on foreign soil for the first time in her life, she was finally, truly, irrevocably free. The first years of freedom were harder than Ruth had imagined. Mexico was not a paradise. The country was poor and politically unstable, recovering from a devastating war with the United States that had cost it half its territory. The areas near the border were particularly chaotic, plagued by bandits and drought and the lingering effects of conflict. Ruth had no money, no connections, no knowledge of Spanish, no skills that were easily marketable in this unfamiliar environment. She had her intelligence, her determination, and her freedom. For a while, that was all she had. She settled initially in the town of Piedras Negras, just across the river from the Texas town of Eagle Pass. The location was convenient for newly arrived refugees from American slavery, and a small community of former slaves had established itself there over the years. Ruth found work as a domestic servant, a role that was painfully familiar, but that at least provided food and shelter while she learned the language and customs of her new country. She was no longer Ruth or Sarah. She chose a new name for her new life, a name that had no connection to anything that had come before. She became Maria Santos, a woman without a past, a person who existed only in the present tense. The education that Caroline Thornton had given her proved surprisingly valuable in Mexico. Ruth's ability to read and write English made her useful to merchants who traded across the border, to lawyers who needed documents translated, to officials who dealt with American authorities on various matters. As her Spanish improved, she became even more valuable, able to move between languages and cultures with a fluency that few others possessed. She began working as a translator and secretary, earning enough to rent her own room and save small amounts for the future. She was building a new life, one word at a time, one transaction at a time. But freedom did not erase the past. Ruth carried the memories of Magnolia Grove with her. The humiliations and cruelties she had witnessed and endured. The knowledge of what slavery truly meant, for those trapped within its grip. She thought about the people she had left behind. The enslaved community at Magnolia Grove, who had no opportunity to escape, who were still laboring in the cotton fields while she walked free under Mexican skies. She thought about Bessie, who had raised her and named her and taught her to hide. She thought about the other children she had grown up with who had been sold, or worked to death, or broken by the system, that Ruth had managed to escape. She also thought about revenge. William Thornton had tried to kill her. He had tried to send her to the sugar plantations of Louisiana, knowing that she would die there within a year. He had lied about her freedom papers, had sent slave catchers to hunt her across half a continent, had done everything in his power to recapture her and punish her for the crime of saving her own life. He had treated her as property, as a problem to be eliminated, as something less than human, and he had never faced any consequences for any of it. Ruth wanted him to face consequences. The desire for revenge was not immediate. In the first years of freedom, survival consumed all of her attention and energy. But as her situation stabilized, as she established herself in her new identity and her new country, the old anger began to resurface. She had escaped, but escape was not justice. She had survived, but survival was not victory. Thornton was still living comfortably on his plantation, still owning and exploiting human beings, still believing that he had the right to destroy anyone who challenged his authority. Ruth began gathering information. She used her position as a translator to access documents and correspondence that crossed the border. Learning about the political and economic conditions in the American South. She maintained contact with the network of abolitionists and escaped slaves who moved between the two countries, collecting intelligence about specific plantations and specific slaveholders. She learned that William Thornton was still operating Magnolia Grove, that his finances had suffered somewhat after the chaos she had created during her escape, but that he remained one of the wealthier planters in Madison County. She also learned about the growing tensions between North and South over the issue of slavery. The Compromise of 1850 had temporarily diffused the conflict, but the underlying issues remained unresolved. Abolitionists in the North were becoming more vocal and more organized. Slaveholders in the South were becoming more defensive and more extreme. Everyone who paid attention understood that the current situation could not continue indefinitely, that eventually the contradictions would explode into open conflict. Ruth saw opportunity in this instability. She began corresponding with abolitionists in the North, using the network of contacts she had developed during her years in Mexico. She shared information about conditions on southern plantations, about the methods slaveholders used to control their property, about the experiences of those who had escaped bondage. Her letters were articulate and detailed, drawing on the education that Caroline Thornton had provided and the analytical skills she had developed during years of managing the Thorntons' business affairs. She wrote under a pseudonym, protecting her identity while making her voice heard. These letters attracted attention. Abolitionists recognized that the information Ruth provided was more detailed and more authoritative than what they typically received from escaped slaves. Most runaways came from the fields and had limited knowledge of their owners' business operations. Ruth had seen the inside of the plantation system, had understood how it functioned economically and socially and politically. Her insights were valuable to people who were trying to dismantle that system. In 1854, Ruth received a letter from a man named William Lloyd Garrison, the editor of The Liberator and one of the most prominent abolitionists in America. Garrison had read Ruth's correspondence and wanted to know more about her story. He wanted to know whether she would be willing to share her experiences publicly, to become a voice in the growing movement against slavery. He wanted to know whether she would consider coming to the North, where she could speak to audiences who needed to understand what slavery truly meant. Ruth considered the offer carefully. Returning to the United States would mean returning to danger. The Fugitive Slave Act was now in effect, requiring citizens to assist in the capture of escaped slaves regardless of what state they lived in. She could be seized in Boston as easily as in Mississippi, could be dragged back to bondage despite everything she had done to escape. Her Mexican citizenship provided some protection, but that protection was uncertain. American slave catchers had been known to operate across borders when the rewards were high enough. But Ruth also understood the power of testimony. She understood that stories could change minds, could shift opinions, could build the political pressure necessary to destroy the institution that had nearly destroyed her. She had survived slavery. She had escaped slavery. Now she had the opportunity to fight slavery, to contribute to its eventual abolition, to ensure that no one else would suffer what she had suffered. She accepted Garrison's invitation. Ruth traveled to Boston in the spring of 1855, arriving in a city that was seething with anti-slavery sentiment. The publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin 3 years earlier had transformed Northern attitudes toward slavery, making the abstract evil concrete and personal. The Anthony Burns case the previous year had outraged Boston citizens who had watched federal marshals drag an escaped slave back to bondage through streets lined with protesters. The city was ready to hear Ruth's story, ready to be moved by her testimony, ready to support the cause that she represented. Her first public speech took place in Faneuil Hall on May 15, 1855. She stood before an audience of more than 2,000 people, looking out at white faces that were eager to hear what she had to say. She was nervous, more nervous than she had been during any of the dangerous moments of her escape. But she had learned to hide her fear, to present a calm exterior regardless of what she felt inside. She took a deep breath. She opened her mouth, and she began to speak. She told them about being born with blue eyes. She told them about the order to kill her, about Hattie's desperate deception, about growing up among people who had saved her life at the risk of their own. She told them about Caroline Thornton, the complicated woman who had educated her while owning her, who had given her tools that she could use to fight while never questioning the system that made the fight necessary. She told them about discovering the plot to send her to Louisiana, about the 17 days of planning and manipulation, about walking away from Magnolia Grove as a free woman while the most powerful men in Madison County stood helpless to stop her. The audience was transfixed. They had heard escaped slaves speak before, had listened to accounts of whippings and separations and the daily cruelties of bondage. But they had never heard a story like Ruth's. They had never encountered a former slave who spoke with such analytical precision, who described the mechanisms of the system with such devastating clarity, who had defeated her oppressors not through physical resistance, but through superior intelligence and planning. Ruth's story challenged everything they thought they knew about enslaved people. It proved that the supposed inferiority of black people was a lie told by those who benefited from that lie. The speech was a sensation. Newspapers throughout the North reported on the blue-eyed former slave who had outwitted her masters. Abolitionists invited Ruth to speak in cities across the region, from New York to Philadelphia to Cleveland to Chicago. She became a celebrity of the movement, her story repeated in pamphlets and articles and sermons. She became proof that slavery was not just morally wrong, but practically doomed. That the system could not survive if enslaved people like Ruth existed. People who were clearly equal or superior to those who claimed to own them. But Ruth had not come to the North simply to tell her story. She had come for revenge. She had never forgotten William Thornton. She had never forgiven him for trying to kill her, for hunting her across the continent, for treating her as something to be disposed of rather than someone to be respected. Now she had a platform. Now she had an audience. Now she had the ability to strike back at the man who had tried to destroy her. She began including Thornton by name in her speeches. She described his plantation, his business practices, his treatment of enslaved people. She detailed the fraud she had discovered during her years of managing his affairs. The debts he had concealed, the partners he had cheated. She exposed him publicly, making his name synonymous with the worst excesses of the slave system, ensuring that his reputation would be destroyed even if he never faced legal consequences for his crimes. The exposure had consequences. Northern businessmen who had previously dealt with Thornton began distancing themselves from the connection. Banks that had extended him credit became more cautious. The cotton factors in New Orleans who purchased his crop started offering lower prices, claiming concerns about the reliability of his shipments. Ruth could not touch Thornton directly, but she could damage him economically, could chip away at the fortune he had built on the bodies of enslaved people. Word of Ruth's speeches reached Madison County. William Thornton learned that the girl he had tried to send to her death was now a famous abolitionist touring northern cities and telling audiences about his crimes. He learned that his name was being cursed in churches and meeting halls, that he had become a villain in the narrative of the anti-slavery movement. He learned that the secrets Ruth carried had not been buried when she escaped, that they were now being broadcast to thousands of people who would never forget. The knowledge destroyed him. Thornton died in 1858, 3 years after Ruth began her speaking tour. The official cause was heart failure, but those who knew him understood that he had been broken by public humiliation, by the collapse of his business relationships, by the realization that a slave he had tried to murder had achieved a revenge more complete than anything physical violence could have accomplished. He died knowing that his name would live in infamy, that he would be remembered not as a gentleman planter, but as a monster who had tried to kill a child for having the wrong color eyes. Ruth continued speaking until the Civil War made her testimony unnecessary. The conflict that everyone had predicted finally arrived, consuming the nation in 4 years of bloodshed that would kill more than 600 Zalozan people. Ruth supported the Union cause, speaking at recruitment rallies and fundraising events, celebrating each Northern victory as a step toward the destruction of the system she had escaped. When the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1863, she wept for the first time in years, overwhelmed by the knowledge that millions of people would experience the freedom she had fought so hard to achieve. She returned to Mexico after the war ended, settling in Mexico City, where she lived until her death in 1891 at the age of 59. She never married. She never had children. She devoted her later years to education, establishing schools for poor children and teaching them to read and write, giving them the same tools that had saved her life. She wrote a memoir that was published in 1878, a detailed account of her escape and her experiences as an abolitionist, a document that historians would later cite as one of the most important first-person accounts of American slavery. The memoir began with the story of her birth, with Hattie's decision to save her life, with the blue eyes that had marked her for death, and ultimately became her signature. It ended with a simple statement that captured everything Ruth had learned during her extraordinary journey. She wrote that she had been born a slave, had lived as a fugitive, had spoken as an activist, and would die as a free woman. She wrote that her eyes had seen cruelty and courage, hatred and hope, the worst and best that human beings were capable of producing. She wrote that freedom was never given, only taken, and that those who waited for permission to be free would wait forever. And she wrote that she had no regrets. The blue-eyed black girl, who should have been killed at birth, had lived to see slavery destroyed. She had contributed to that destruction with her words and her witness and her refusal to accept the fate that the system had assigned her. She had proven that intelligence could defeat power, that determination could overcome oppression, that one person with the will to fight could change the course of history. She had been impossible from the moment she was born. She had remained impossible for 59 years of struggle and survival, and in the end, the impossible had won.